Captain Arthur Jonas stood at the observation deck of the Endeavour, his gaze fixed on the distant alien structure looming in the void. It was a fortress unlike any humanity had ever encountered. Its jagged spires radiated an eerie blue glow, pulsing in a rhythm that suggested an intelligence beyond comprehension. His fingers tightened around the data pad in his hand, the weight of its contents pressing down on him more than the artificial gravity of the ship. The intercepted messages had been fragmented, their encryption nearly impenetrable, but what little his team had deciphered was enough to confirm his worst fears. The Zynari, one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy, were preparing to move against Earth. Lieutenant Kayla Dorn entered the deck, her expression tense. "Captain, the decryption team just confirmed the rest of the data," she said, handing him the pad. "It's worse than we thought. They've been coordinating with several other factions, all plotting to dismantle Earth's influence in the Celestial Conclave." Jonas took the pad and scanned the newly decrypted files. The documents detailed secret meetings, military deployments, and a chilling directive. Project Eclipse. The Zynari intended to cripple human expansion by targeting their most vital colonies and technological hubs, using methods that would appear as random accidents or natural disasters. Coordinated assault disguised as misfortune. New Terra, Elysia Outpost, and the Erexian mining outposts were all marked for destruction. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing through the implications. Humanity had only been part of the Celestial Conclave for a decade, and in that time they had proven themselves resourceful, innovative, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. Unlike many of the older species, humans had not spent millennia refining a single technological path. They adapted, combined, and restructured ideas in ways that often defied logic. It had earned them both admiration and resentment. The Zynari and their allies had underestimated them before, but this time their plan was more insidious. Dorn watched him closely. "What do we do, Captain?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Jonas looked up from the datapad, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers. "We act," he said simply. "We can't afford to wait for the Coalition to convene another diplomatic session. They've already made their decision." He gestured toward the fortress ahead. "This is where it begins." The Endeavour had been stationed near the Zynari stronghold to monitor any unusual activity, and now that surveillance had proven invaluable. The Zynari had built their empire on secrecy and control, manipulating the Coalition from the shadows. But their arrogance had led them to overlook a crucial truth. Humans were not just survivors. They were strategists. Dorn hesitated. "Earth Command will need to be informed immediately." Jonas nodded. "Send the report, Priority Alpha, but don't let anyone else see it. Not yet." She hesitated, then nodded. "Understood, sir." The ship's bridge buzzed with quiet urgency as the crew processed the new intelligence. Jonas knew that if they acted too soon, they might tip their hand. If they waited too long, the damage would be irreversible. The Zynari believed they had the advantage, that humanity's reliance on diplomacy and cooperation made them predictable. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the human ability to adapt, to innovate under pressure, and to fight when necessary. As the Endeavour drifted closer to the fortress, Jonas felt the weight of history pressing upon him. The Zynari had built their empire over thousands of years, shaping the Coalition into a structure that favored their control. But humans had something different. They had spent their history in constant conflict, not just against external threats, but against their own kind. They had learned to survive by outthinking their enemies, by turning disadvantages into opportunities. He turned back to Dorn. "Prepare the ship for departure. We're leaving in 2 hours." She raised an eyebrow. "Sir, we're in Zynari territory. If they detect us leaving..." "They won't," Jonas interrupted. "We have a contingency plan, one that the Zynari never accounted for." A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of Dorner's lips. "Operation Aegis." Jonas nodded. "Exactly. We've been preparing for this for years, and now it's time to show them what happens when they try to contain humanity." The fortress ahead remained silent, its pulsing light a reminder of the power that lay within. But Jonas knew that power alone did not win wars. It was the will to act, the ability to turn the tide when all seemed lost. And humanity had that, in abundance. The Zynari were a species of ancient lineage, their empire stretching across the galaxy for over 4,000 years. With their sleek, obsidian-hued warships and mastery of gravitational manipulation, they had long been considered one of the most formidable forces in the coalition. Their society was built on rigid hierarchies and an unyielding belief in their own superiority, a mindset that had allowed them to subtly control the coalition's policies for centuries. Unlike the more diplomatic factions that sought peaceful expansion, the Zynari viewed the galaxy as a delicate balance that required strict oversight. They believed that unchecked progress led to chaos, and they had seen the human approach to technology as dangerously unpredictable. High Chancellor Vera, the supreme ruler of the Zynari, had always regarded humanity with a mix of fascination and disdain. Their rapid advancement in space travel, artificial intelligence, and biological engineering had outpaced even the most developed species. What disturbed her most was their willingness to experiment with unstable or unconventional methods. While the Zynari perfected each innovation through millennia of refinement, humans embraced trial and error, often achieving results that defied established logic. Their ability to adapt was not just impressive, it was terrifying. If left unchecked, the Zynari feared humanity would disrupt the carefully maintained order of the coalition. Vera's advisors had warned her for years that humans were a wild card, their unpredictable nature making them difficult to control. But it wasn't until Earth's recent breakthroughs in quantum energy that the Zynari decided to act. The humans had developed a power source that could sustain entire colonies with minimal resources, a technology that threatened the Zynari's monopoly on gravitational energy fields. If humanity continued to advance at this rate, they would soon surpass even the oldest species in technological dominance. The intercepted messages revealed that the Zynari had been in secret communication with several other factions, including the Varelians, known for their advanced energy weapons, and the Threxians, a reptilian species with a vast military fleet. These alliances were not new. Many had existed in the shadows of the coalition for decades, built on mutual interests in maintaining power and suppressing emerging threats. But now, they had coalesced into something more dangerous, a coordinated effort to dismantle human influence before it could spread further. The plan was insidious. The Zynari would orchestrate a series of accidents across human-controlled systems. A sudden gravitational collapse near Elysia Outpost would render its orbit unstable, forcing its evacuation. A target energy surge would wipe out the Erexian mining outposts, crippling Earth's resource supply. And New Terra, humanity's largest colony, would suffer a mysterious bioweapon outbreak, engineered by the Varelians using stolen human genetic data. Each incident would be framed as an unfortunate but natural disaster, ensuring that the coalition's other members would not unite against the Zynari. Vera had justified the operation with cold pragmatism. The humans are a virus, she had told her council. They spread rapidly, adapting to any environment, consuming resources without regard for balance. We must contain them before they consume everything. Yet, despite their meticulous planning, the Zynari had overlooked a fundamental truth about humans. They did not rely solely on technology. They relied on instinct, resilience, and an unshakable drive to survive. The coalition's older species had long believed that humanity's chaotic past made them unfit for galactic diplomacy, that their history of war and destruction would eventually lead to their downfall. But they failed to see that this history had shaped humanity into something far more dangerous than mere aggression. It had made them unpredictable. Jonas understood this better than most. He had spent years studying the Zynari, analyzing their tactics, their history, their weaknesses. They were methodical, precise, and utterly unprepared for an enemy that refused to play by their rules. The humans had spent centuries fighting against impossible odds, against forces far superior in technology and strength. They had survived climate collapse, pandemics, and internal wars that should have destroyed them. The Zynari believed they were dealing with a young species eager to prove itself, but they were wrong. They were dealing with survivors who had learned to thrive in adversity. As the Endeavor drifted silently near the Zynari fortress, Jonas clenched his jaw. The Zynari had underestimated Earth, believing that their technological edge and centuries of experience would ensure dominance. But they had not accounted for the very thing that had allowed humans to endure, their relentless ability to adapt, to find solutions where none seemed possible. He turned to Dorn. "Signal the fleet. We move in 2 hours." She nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. They won't see it coming. No, Jonas thought. They wouldn't. And when they did, it would be too late. The Endeavor's bridge hummed with quiet urgency as the crew prepared for departure. Jonas moved swiftly, his mind already several steps ahead. The Zynari had spent centuries perfecting their gravitational manipulation, using it to control entire star systems and enforce their will without direct confrontation. But humanity had spent its history fighting wars where brute force was not always an option, where survival depended on strategy, deception, and the ability to turn an enemy's strength into a weakness. "Begin preparations for Operation Aegis," Jones ordered, his voice calm but firm. Lieutenant Dorn hesitated only briefly before responding. "Aye, sir. Initiating sequence." The operation was humanity's most closely guarded secret. While the Zynari believed their gravitational control was absolute, the humans had spent the last decade developing a countermeasure, quantum disruption nodes. These devices, hidden across human-controlled space, could generate localized gravitational distortions that interfered with the Zynari's energy fields. Unlike the Zynari's refined and stable systems, humanity's technology was raw, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective in the right hands. Jonas had overseen the project personally. The nodes had been deployed under the guise of civilian infrastructure, their true purpose known only to a select few within Earth Command. The Zynari had focused on Earth's diplomatic presence, on its trade agreements and military posturing, but they had failed to notice the quiet expansion of humanity's quantum capabilities. "Captain," Dorn said as she studied her console, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command." Jonas turned toward the main display as the holographic image of President Cynthia Lex flickered into view. Her expression was grim, her voice steady. "Captain Jonas, we've reviewed your report. The Zynari's plot is unacceptable, and we will not allow Earth's colonies to be sacrificed for their ambitions." Jonas nodded. "We're already en route, Madam President, but we need authorization for immediate action." Lex's eyes darkened. "You have it. We've assembled a fleet of quantum-class vessels, silent, undetectable, and fully equipped with the Aegis nodes. They're waiting for your command." Jonas allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Understood. We'll execute Phase 1 as soon as we reach the rendezvous point." The transmission ended, and the bridge fell silent for a moment before Dorn spoke. "Sir, if we deploy the nodes now, we risk revealing our hand before we're ready." Jonas turned to face her. "That's exactly what we want." She blinked in surprise. "You want them to know?" He stepped closer, his voice low but certain. "Not the full extent of our capabilities, just enough to make them hesitate. The Zynari thrive on control, on the certainty of their advantage. If we introduce doubt, if we show them that we can disrupt their gravitational fields, they'll question their own strategy." Dorn considered this, then nodded. "And if they still attack?" Jonas's expression hardened. "Then we prove that their control isn't just fragile, it's obsolete." The Endeavor initiated its departure, its engines humming with a near-silent energy signature designed to evade Zynari detection systems. As the ship moved away from the fortress, Jonas turned his attention to the tactical display. The quantum-class fleet was positioned at the edge of human space, each vessel carrying a disruption node capable of generating gravitational anomalies, strong enough to immobilize even the largest Zynari warships. "Signal the fleet," Jonas instructed. "We're moving to the first target, Elysia Outpost. If the Zynari plan to strike there, we'll be ready." Dorn's fingers moved swiftly over the console. "Transmitting now. They're awaiting your orders." Jonas exhaled, his mind already mapping out the next phase. The Zynari believed they had humanity cornered, that their control over gravitational fields made them untouchable. But they had underestimated the human capacity for ingenuity. While the Zynari had spent millennia refining their technology, humanity had spent centuries surviving by any means necessary. He turned to the viewport, watching as the fortress faded into the distance. The Zynari had built their empire on the premise that power was absolute, that control ensured stability. But humans had never relied on absolute power. They had learned to win battles with unconventional tactics, with calculated risks, with the ability to strike where their enemies least expected. And now, it was time to remind the galaxy why they had survived every threat thrown their way. The Zynari fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their obsidian warships slicing through the void like silent predators. General Korak, the Varelian commander overseeing the assault, studied the tactical display from the bridge of the Dominion's will. Elysia Outpost floated below them, its orbital platforms dark and inactive. The humans had made no move to defend their colony. "Begin deployment," Korak ordered, his voice smooth and unwavering. The first wave of Varelian dropships descended toward the surface, their sleek, angular forms designed for rapid insertion and overwhelming firepower. As they passed through the upper atmosphere, the planet's gravitational sensors registered a fluctuation, subtle, barely perceptible. Korak's brow furrowed. "Report," he demanded. The science officer scanned the data. "It's localized, anomalous gravitational distortions, but they don't match human defensive patterns." Korak leaned forward. "They know we're here." He was right. On Elysia Outpost's surface, Captain Jones and his team had been waiting. The colony's orbital defenses had been deliberately powered down, creating the illusion of vulnerability. But beneath the surface, humanity's true defense had already been activated. "Now," Jonas said into his communicator. With a pulse of energy, the quantum disruption nodes embedded in the planet's crust came online. Gravitational fields twisted and collapsed in unpredictable patterns, sending the Varelian dropships into chaotic spirals. Some crashed into the icy terrain, others were caught in sudden, crushing gravity wells that rendered their propulsion systems useless. The Zynari flagship, the Unbroken Chain, attempted to compensate, but the distortions were too erratic. Korak's screen flickered as his fleet's telemetry became unstable. "What is happening?" he demanded. "The humans," the science officer replied, his voice laced with disbelief. "They've somehow altered the gravitational field beneath us. Our ships can't stabilize." Korak's grip tightened on his command console. He had expected resistance, but not this. The humans had not built their defenses in the sky. They had buried them beneath the very ground they stood on. On the surface, Lieutenant Dorn monitored the quantum nodes from a hidden control station. "They're trapped," she reported. "Their fleet can't maneuver without risking structural collapse." Jonas nodded. "Good. Let's make sure they understand the rest of the message." He turned to his second-in-command, Commander Rourke, who stood ready with a small fleet of human strike vessels, sleek, agile, and designed for one purpose: to deliver a payload that would leave no doubt about humanity's resolve. "Deploy the Sentinels," Jonas ordered. Rourke acknowledged and transmitted the command. From the shadows of Elysia Outpost's moons, the first wave of Sentinels emerged. Small, drone-like ships that had been humanity's answer to superior firepower. They were not warships in the traditional sense, but they carried something far more dangerous: quantum beacons. The Zynari had built their empire on the ability to control gravitational fields, but the Sentinels had been designed to exploit that very strength. As they closed in on the immobilized Varelian and Zynari ships, they deployed the beacons, small, self-sustaining quantum anchors that latched onto the enemy vessels. Once activated, they would create permanent gravitational distortions tied directly to the human command network. Korak realized the danger too late. "Disengage from orbit," he barked, but the gravitational distortions had already taken hold. The Dominions will shuddered as the quantum beacons locked onto its hull, transmitting a signal that Jones' fleet could trace across the stars. "Commander," the science officer reported, "if these beacons remain active, the humans will be able to track our fleet anywhere in the galaxy." Korak's hands curled into fists. "They think they can threaten us with this?" Jonas's voice cut through the communication channels, calm and unyielding. This is a warning. If any of your ships ever enter human-controlled space again, we will not ask twice. We will end you. Korak's eyes narrowed. You believe this changes anything? Jonas's reply was simple. You'll see. As the Zynari and Varelian forces struggled to regain control, the other human colonies prepared for their own defenses. The Zynari had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, and now they would learn the cost of their arrogance. The retreat from Elysia Outpost was not just a tactical failure. It was a humiliating exposure of the Zynari's vulnerabilities. The Dominion's will and its fleet had been immobilized by gravitational distortions they could not counter, their ships tagged with quantum beacons that would allow humanity to track their movements indefinitely. The retreat was orderly, but the damage to Zynari prestige was irreversible. Across the coalition, the older species that had once deferred to the Zynari's authority now questioned their supremacy. High Chancellor Vera did not wait for the full retreat to complete before summoning an emergency session of the Celestial Conclave. The chamber, a vast, domed structure suspended in orbit around the Zynari homeworld, was filled with holographic projections of coalition representatives. Some were already in a state of panic, others merely curious. The Threxians, known for their militaristic tendencies, demanded immediate retaliation. The Varelians, whose energy weapons had been neutralized by the quantum disruptions, were more cautious. And the smaller species, those who had long been subjected to the Zynari's influence, watched in silence, waiting to see which way the tide would turn. Vera's voice was sharp, her 4 eyes scanning the assembly. The humans have overstepped, she declared. They have deployed technology that violates coalition agreements. We must act decisively before they consolidate their advantage. General Korak, still aboard the Dominion's will, responded through the transmission. We have acted, Chancellor, he said, his tone edged with frustration. And we were outmaneuvered. The humans have something we did not anticipate. A quantum disruption field that nullifies our gravitational control. If we strike again without preparation, we will lose more than just this battle. A murmur of unease rippled through the chamber. The Zynari's dominance had been built on their ability to control space itself. If humanity had found a way to disrupt that control, then the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in ways no one could ignore. Representative Neria of the Lorian Alliance, a younger species that had only joined the coalition a century ago, spoke next. The humans did not initiate this conflict, she said, her feathered crest rising in agitation. They responded to an unprovoked attack. If we retaliate without proof of their aggression, we will be the ones violating the coalition's principles. Vera's lower eyes narrowed. You speak as though the humans are the victims in this. They have clearly been developing this technology in secret, preparing for an eventual confrontation. That is not diplomacy, it is deception. Neria's gaze did not waver. And yet, we all know who truly initiated the first strike. The humans have shown restraint. They did not destroy your fleet, they merely neutralized it. If they had wanted war, they could have ended it before it began. A new voice cut through the discussion, Representative Thaler of the Varelian Empire. This is not about restraint, he countered. It is about power. If the humans can manipulate gravitational fields at will, they can control entire star systems. We cannot allow them to dictate the future of the coalition. Before Vera could respond, another transmission interrupted. It was President Cynthia Lex of Earth, her image appearing in the central holographic display. Unlike the coalition's leaders, who still clung to their hierarchies and formalities, Lex's presence was commanding without needing to assert dominance. Let's be clear, she said, her voice calm but firm. We did not provoke this conflict. We revealed the Zynari's plot because we had no choice. If you had honored the coalition's principles, we would not be here having this discussion. She let her words settle before continuing. But we are offering a path forward. We are not here to conquer. We are here to ensure our survival. Vera's upper eyes blinked in rapid succession, a sign of internal debate within the Zynari leadership. You expect us to simply accept this? She asked. Lex met her gaze evenly. No, I expect you to understand that the galaxy has changed. The coalition was built on the premise that older species would guide the younger ones. But the truth is, it was built on control, on suppression, on keeping new species from advancing too quickly. You feared humanity because we refused to follow that model. Silence stretched across the chamber. Then, one by one, representatives from smaller coalition species began to speak. Some expressed concern, others outright support. The Lorians, the Travaris, the Drullery, all had suffered under the Zynari's quiet dominance, their technological progress stifled, their diplomatic voices drowned out. Now, they saw an opportunity to break free. We propose a new alliance, Neria declared. Not one built on hierarchy and control, but on mutual cooperation. A council where all species have equal standing. The idea was radical. The coalition had never known such a structure. But the Zynari's authority had been shaken. And for the first time in millennia, the galaxy was faced with a choice. Cling to the old order or embrace a new future. Vera's lower eyes darkened. And if we refuse? Lex's expression did not change. Then we will continue to defend ourselves by any means necessary. But we will not be the only ones standing against you. The chamber erupted into debate. Some factions argued for continued resistance, others for cautious diplomacy. But the fractures had already formed. The Zynari's grip on the coalition was slipping, and for the first time in its history, the galaxy was on the verge of a new era. One where humans were not just members of the coalition, but key architects of its future. As the emergency session of the Celestial Conclave descended into chaos, Captain Jonas and Lieutenant Dorn stood in the command center of the Endeavor, watching the unfolding debate with quiet satisfaction. The Zynari and their allies were scrambling to respond, their confidence shaken by the unexpected human counterstrike. But what they did not know, what no one outside of Earth Command had been told, was that humanity's technological advantage was not as overwhelming as it seemed. Dorn glanced at Jonas, her voice hushed. They think we have a dozen quantum disruption nodes, she said. That we've been preparing for years. Jonas nodded, his expression unreadable. Let them keep thinking that. In reality, humanity had only managed to deploy 3 operational quantum disruption sites, Elysia Outpost, New Terra, and Erexion. The technology was real, but it was far from stable. The gravitational distortions were unpredictable, and the energy consumption required to maintain them at full strength was immense. If the Zynari had pushed harder, if they had ignored the initial paralysis and committed more forces, they might have overwhelmed the human defenses before Earth could fully activate the remaining nodes. But they hadn't. They had hesitated, and that hesitation had been humanity's greatest weapon. Dorn exhaled. If they call our bluff. They won't, Jonas said with certainty. The Zynari operate on logic, on centuries of experience. They've built their empire on calculated risk and absolute control. This uncertainty terrifies them. She looked down at the tactical display, where the Zynari fleet still hovered at the edge of human space. But we can't keep up this level of disruption for long. If they try again, we might not be able to stop them. Jonas allowed himself a small, grim smile. That's why we don't need to stop them forever. We just need to make them believe we can. The human deception extended beyond the quantum disruption nodes. The Sentinels, those sleek, drone-like vessels that had immobilized the Zynari and Varelian ships, were not as numerous as the enemy believed. The fleet that had deployed them was not a massive armada, but a carefully orchestrated illusion. Human ships had been rerouted, their signals masked to appear as though they were larger in number than they truly were. The Zynari had seen what they expected to see, a superior coordinated human response. But the reality was far more precarious. The true brilliance of Operation Aegis had been its psychological impact. The Zynari and their allies had spent their history in control, manipulating the galaxy through superior technology and strategic dominance. But humanity had turned their own tactics against them. The quantum disruption field had not been designed to destroy. It had been designed to paralyze. And the beacons, They were not permanent death sentences, but they were enough to make the Zynari question whether the humans could track their movements with precision. "They're afraid of us," Dorn murmured, watching the Zynari flagship's sluggish retreat. "Not because we're stronger, but because we're unpredictable." Jonas turned from the display, his voice calm. "Exactly. They thought they could contain us by following the same patterns they used on other species. But humans don't operate like them. We don't wait for approval. We don't follow rigid hierarchies. We act." Dorn looked at him, realization dawning. "So what happens next?" Jonas' gaze returned to the Zynari fleet. "Now we wait. They'll retreat, regroup, and try to find a way to counter what they believe we have. But by the time they figure out the truth, we'll have already solidified our position." The deception had been necessary. Humanity had spent years preparing for this moment. But they had not been ready for an all-out war. The quantum disruption nodes were experimental, the sentinels were still being refined, and the fleet that had responded to the attack was a fraction of what the Zynari believed it to be. If the Zynari had pressed the assault, if they had committed fully, humanity would have been forced into a desperate, last-ditch defense. But they hadn't. They had seen the strength of the human response, believed in its strength, and backed down. Jonas exhaled slowly. "We played them exactly as we hoped." Dorn nodded, then hesitated. "But what if they come back? What if they realize the truth?" Jonas turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll be ready. And next time, we won't need to bluff." The emergency session of the Celestial Conclave had ended in disarray. Some factions had already begun withdrawing their representatives, unwilling to risk another confrontation with Earth. Others, like the Varelians and Threxians, remained in tense discussions, their leaders weighing the cost of continued resistance. But the most telling sign of the shifting balance of power was the Zynari themselves. High Chancellor Vera had not spoken again after Captain Jones's final transmission. She had simply ended the session, her expression unreadable, her fleet retreating without further action. On Earth, the implications of the standoff were immediate. President Lex convened an emergency meeting with Earth Command, where military leaders and diplomatic advisors debated the next course of action. The Zynari had underestimated them, but that did not mean the threat was over. The older species still held vast resources, and if they regrouped, they could launch a new assault. Yet Jonas knew that the Zynari were not the only ones who had miscalculated. Humanity had been given a choice: to continue down the path of diplomacy within the coalition, or to forge a new future on their own terms. Jonas sat in the war room, his fingers resting on the holographic display of human space. "We can't wait for them to recover," he said. "If we want peace, we have to define the terms ourselves." Lieutenant Dorn, standing beside him, nodded. "The smaller factions already see the writing on the wall. They want out of the Zynari's control, but they need a guarantee that Earth won, not just in this battle, but in the long run." President Lex considered this, and then gave a single, decisive nod. "Then we give them that guarantee. We don't need the coalition as it was. We need something better." Within days, Earth had issued a new proposal to the galaxy: the formation of the United Stellar Accord. Unlike the old coalition, which had been dominated by the Zynari and their allies, the Accord would be a council of equals. Every species, regardless of age or technological advancement, would have a voice. Trade agreements, defense pacts, and technological exchanges would be transparent and mutually beneficial. No longer would the older races dictate the terms of expansion. No longer would younger species be forced into submission under the guise of diplomatic oversight. The response was swift. The Lorian Alliance, the Traveris, and even the Drillari pledged their support. The Varelians, despite their recent losses, cautiously agreed to negotiate. The Threxians remained hesitant, but even they understood that the Zynari's influence had been irreparably damaged. The Zynari themselves did not immediately respond. For the first time in their long history, they were not the architects of galactic policy. They were now faced with a choice: adapt or be left behind. Captain Jonas stood at the newly established meeting ground, a neutral asteroid station at the edge of human space, watching as the first representatives of the United Stellar Accord arrived. Lieutenant Dorn walked beside him, her gaze scanning the newcomers. "They're still watching us," she murmured. "Even the ones who claim to support the Accord." Jonas exhaled. "They're trying to figure out how far our bluff can go." Dorn smirked. "And if they push too far?" Jonas met her gaze with a small, knowing smile. "Then we stop bluffing." The meeting began with cautious diplomacy, but beneath the surface, the message was clear. Humanity had arrived as a force to be reckoned with. They had not just survived the Zynari's attempts at suppression. They had reshaped the galaxy's future in the process. And this time, they would not be the ones forced to prove their worth. The rest of the galaxy would have to prove that they were ready to stand as equals. The Endeavor drifted in the void, its sleek hull reflecting the distant light of a nearby star. Captain Jonas stood at the observation deck, watching as the first representatives of the United Stellar Accord arrived at the neutral station. The once unthinkable had now become reality. Species that had spent centuries under the Zynari's dominance were now gathering on equal footing with humanity, not as subordinates, but as partners in a new galactic order. Lieutenant Dorn joined him, her expression unreadable. "It's strange," she murmured. "Only a few weeks ago we were preparing to defend our colonies against an overwhelming force. Now, they're coming to us not with weapons, but with proposals." Jonas gave a small, wry smile. "They're still trying to figure out how much power we actually have. They see the Accord as a way to maintain some control, to keep us from becoming too dominant." Dorn crossed her arms. "And are we?" Jonas turned to face her, his gaze steady. "We could be, but that's not our goal." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what is our goal, Captain?" He looked out at the station, where the banners of the newly formed alliance floated in the void. The old coalition had been built on hierarchy, on the unspoken rule that the younger species would follow the older ones. The Zynari had believed that order was their right, that they had earned it through millennia of governance. But humanity had never been part of that structure. They had not been taught to accept their place. They had been born into a world where survival meant adaptation, where dominance was never guaranteed, only earned. The Zynari thought they could control the galaxy because they had stability, Jonas said. They believed that their empire, their technology, their history made them untouchable. But humans don't play by those rules. We don't need centuries to build our strength. We need the right idea at the right time. Dorn nodded slowly. "And the right bluff." Jonas chuckled. "Even better." He turned back to the viewport, where the Dominions hovered at a cautious distance. The Zynari were so focused on their own control that they never considered what would happen if someone disrupted it. They thought we were still trying to fit into the coalition's structure, still trying to play by their rules, but we never were. She studied him for a moment. "So what now?" He exhaled, watching as the first Accord representatives disembarked onto the station. "Now, we show them the alternative. We don't want to rule. We want to coexist. But we'll make damn sure they understand that if they try to manipulate the Accord the way they did the coalition, they'll find themselves facing something far worse than a few gravitational distortions." Dorn smirked. "You always did like to keep people guessing." Jonas's expression turned serious. "It's not about guessing. It's about making sure they never feel confident enough to make the same mistake again." Behind them, the Endeavor's crew prepared for the historic meeting. The future of the galaxy would be decided not by war, but by diplomacy. Yet Jonas knew that diplomacy was just another battlefield, one where humanity had already proven they could win. As the first Accord delegates entered the chamber, the holographic display above the circular table flickered to life, showing the new emblem of the Alliance, a ring of stars, each one connected by thin lines of light, symbolizing the unity of all species. It was a stark contrast to the Coalition's old insignia, where the Zynari's emblem had been placed at the center, looming over the others like a silent threat. Jonas stepped forward, taking his place at the table. The Zynari representatives were there, their expressions carefully neutral, but their posture betrayed their discomfort. They had spent thousands of years shaping the galaxy's politics, its trade, its technology. Now, they were just one voice among many. He met Vera's gaze across the table. "Welcome to the new order," he said simply. She did not respond immediately, but after a long pause, she inclined her head. It was not a sign of submission, merely acknowledgement. Jonas knew that the battle was not truly over. The Zynari would not disappear overnight. The Varelians, the Threxians, and others would continue to watch, waiting for a sign of weakness. But humanity had already won the war that mattered. They had forced the galaxy to recognize that power was not just about size or age. It was about adaptability, about the willingness to challenge the old ways and build something better. As the session began, Jonas allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The Zynari had spent their history believing they were the architects of the galaxy's stability. But now, they would learn the truth. Humanity had not just survived. They had reshaped the galaxy. And they were only getting started.